Welcome to the IoT podcast show. I'm your host, Tom White. Today I'm joined by Tim Panagos. Tim is the CTO of Microshare.io. Microshare bring smart building solutions to life. They also provide enterprise scale IoT integration for real-time infection control, predictive cleaning, occupancy and asset zoning in smart buildings without sacrificing any privacy. With COVID-19 making health metrics a matter of life and death right now, Microshare's IoT application is extremely relevant and extremely popular also. The company is on track to do 32 million in turnover, and they have just closed an additional round of funding. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Tim, can we just kick off by just explaining a little bit about your background in IoT and how you got into this position here at Microshare?
Certainly. I am not a classic IoT technologist. I really come at this from a career that has been mostly about artificial intelligence of various kinds. And I don't mean that to sound like the super sexy kind of AI. I mean this is for banks to run their operations better kind of AI. And I started in that back in the 90s and have kind of tracked it through. So my career has really been about the application of data to improve businesses, and necessarily the data integration, data engineering that goes along with data acquisition. And that's kind of the perspective we brought into Microshare with IoT, which is, for us, it's not really about the devices or about the network, the protocols, a lot of the things that I see classic IoT having to have been obsessed about over the last decade. What we're really looking at is working from the solution towards the data acquisition. And that's kind of what Microshare is about. So our angle on IoT is give us the data so that we can do good things for the business. And I think closing that gap between the device-oriented IoT side, the network-oriented, the device-oriented, and the businesses that have problems running operations that they want insights for. And we're kind of trying to be the glue that sticks those two things together in a commercial way.
Yeah, fantastic. Could you briefly talk a little bit about the sensing as a service model that you have and the importance of this, Tim, within the development of smart buildings, and particularly, obviously, in the context of COVID-19 and everything we've been through over the past year?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think part and parcel of what I just answered about my background, I think one of the key things that have been missing in the mainstream part of the market for people who want to consume IoT, who aren't early adopters, is really nailing down a business model that works for everybody. And so sensing as a service is really the business model that we've adopted, and so far has been quite popular, which really doesn't ask the business to care about devices or networks and make choices in those cases, pay specific fees, buy specific devices, manage batteries, all the things that one must do to operate an IoT network. Instead, we say, look, you're paying for the data, and in reality, you're really paying for the insights. And so let's try to wrap all of that into a single business model so that you're not buying devices and owning devices. That's not, most businesses don't want to get involved at that layer. They just want the information that's going to help them operate. So we really kind of roll everything together into a single kind of subscription fee, and we manage all the devices, we manage the network, we manage the data, we do all of the things that get the business to the insight, and that allows people to kind of bypass a lot of the science projects that I think IoT has been plagued with. Where people kind of kick the tires and try things out. And I think there's just been a tremendous amount of failure in that case, because we're asking people to both envision what's possible with these technologies, but then also break down a lot of barriers on their own. And early adopters can do that. People with really strong use cases, deep wallets, have been able to do that in the past, but the mainstream of the market doesn't look like that. And so that's really what sensing as a service, I think, is trying to do, is couple the business model to what's now available in the technology space, because I think we're in a unique position, maybe in the history of IoT, but certainly over the last 5 years, we've got a plethora of devices. We've got some fairly mature networking technologies. We've got cloud computing. We've got ubiquitous AI tools. And really the challenge is stitching all those things together so that people don't have to wade through the choices and do the integrations. And that's kind of where we've been with that business model. So I think it's the business model that can unlock that value. Still got to do all the stuff, right? Stuff to pick the devices, manage the network, all these things. But let's do it for the business so that they don't also have to become IoT experts in order to get the advantages of using data to manage their business, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really nice model. I mean, we see a lot of software as a service models in the tech industry. Commercially, it makes sense from a long-term revenue perspective for the consumer or from the company that may be entering into that agreement. There isn't the high upfront cost that traditionally would have if you were buying something outright.
Yeah.
It's the support, it's the fact that you can have this ongoing maintenance, an ongoing relationship. And it's really transcending lots of different industries. Curiously, from all of the podcasts that we've done and a lot of my work in IoT, there aren't as many people uptaking solutions as a service as I see, and it's interesting to know that. And I wonder if it's the encapsulation of the end-to-end IoT program or service offering that they're trying to give, whether they find that quite difficult or not. But I'd like to see more of it in the future, and as I'm sure some of the people that you're working with, would as well. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Just in general. I mean, do you think a lot more companies will be offering this from a specific IoT perspective?
I think the answer is yes. I think it's inevitable, as you said, Tom. SaaS is the dominant model for software now, and that's radically changed over the last 10, 20 years, right? From enterprise software buys now to SaaS adoption. And it's quite natural, I think, for that to extend into the IoT space, the AI space. The challenge, though, with it is, of course, that we're not a pure SaaS. It isn't pure software because there are these clumsy devices. There's a physical component, a very real important physical component to IoT that makes this very different from an operational model as a company than a pure SaaS, let's say Salesforce, right? Salesforce can light up a new account, like that. They don't have to worry about the logistics of delivering devices, installing devices, managing connectivity. So in a lot of ways, we're more like a telecom company than we are like a Salesforce, right? With this pure software. And I think that's part of the challenge is we've got companies that are generally either masters of the physical domain and logistics of shipping and procurement, or we've got people who mastered the software side and can do things at scale and provision quickly and deliver good service. And what we're trying to do at Microsoft Microshare is quite difficult, is put those two things together and be good at the logistics and good at the software and kind of slide those two things together. So I think it's inevitable that more people will do it this way, but it is really tricky to get right. It's really tricky.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. I guess if in the future you had more standardization around hardware, let's say sensors off the shelf, because a lot of hardware these days is off the shelf outside of the IoT industry,
That's right.
Then perhaps what you could lock into is firmware updates and what have you to actually make that specific for what your functionality is. Because, you're right, Salesforce can just fire up an account, in a couple of seconds and there you are. You've got access to everything. You've got your tenant registers.
Yeah.
Not quite as easy when you've got to ship out the sensors and hardware in the post, etc. But not impossible, clearly.
Indeed. And we have specialized in the LoRaWAN ecosystem, which is a pretty popular branch of the LPWAN. So we deal mostly with sensing. I guess it's implicit in the sensing as a service, right? So there is actuation, but when we talk about IoT, I really mean long range, low power, generally battery operated sensing And we don't make any hardware. We buy all of these things off the shelf within the LoRaWAN space. So there's a motion sensor, there's a very popular feedback sensor. And so what we do is kind of buy these things out of the LoRa ecosystem. And LoRa is a fairly decent specification. Is a lot of gaps, don't get me wrong. The data from all these devices is radically different. So it's still a challenge to take, even something simple like a temperature and humidity sensor. Almost every manufacturer in LoRa offers a temperature and humidity. It's, sort of the table stakes for sensing, but they all use a different data format. Even though the data is quite simple, you still have to deal with that vendor specifics. So we have this specific layer that does that translation. And ultimately, our goal is to get all the data to look the same, standard JSON presentations, so that the downstream can really divorce itself from the details of the sensor, the details of the network. So I think we are at that point where the standards are good enough to really allow a company like ours to exist. I think they will get better and better, clearer and clearer as the integrated ecosystem comes together. And, I think, as you said in the intro, we do a lot of different things. We tend to focus on what we call the built space, commercial real estate, another way of saying it for the most part. But we don't focus on a single device or a single use case. We tend to really be aiming at heterogeneous kind of deployment. So we're going to necessarily deal with lots of different types of sensors, lots of different vendors of sensors, lots of different networks of sensors. There's public and private LoRa networks. They're all a little bit different, and we want to boil out all of the distinctions so that the data looks the same, the insights are viable, and that necessarily also allows us to kind of pick the best vendors and mix and match as we go into the future. So as you're, to your point, managing at the firmware layer may not even be necessary, because I can let the standard speak for itself, and then I can let the vendors compete for price and reliability, battery life, duration, these kind of principles that kind of matter most to a company like mine. And that's, I think, really hasn't been possible until now. And like I said, the standards are just going to get stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to touch on the solutions then. So, for those that aren't aware of Microshare, so your solution really encompasses all components that will form a smart building, homes, commercial, etc. How does your solution address, for instance, security and data privacy?
Yeah, I think you mentioned in an earlier question, I breezed past it. Contact tracing has been a real focus of ours over the last year. And at this time, literally this date last year, I could have told you that we had in mind contact tracing, but it was maybe a matter of days, right? So January of 2020, never thought a moment about it, but we kind of onboarded that as part of this heterogeneous approach to data. And contact tracing, as opposed to temperature and humidity of a space, obviously carries with it a lot more weight of privacy and security, necessarily. And so that's been a big focus of ours from the start. We're called Microshare, which may strike people as odd if you think of us as an IoT company, but really at a fundamental level, what we're really hitting at is the need to reimagine how data is collected, owned, and then distributed, so that people can take advantage of that data to make better decisions across an ecosystem, right? And the built space, right, as you said, offices and factories and airports and prisons and homes, these are often the intersection of ecosystems, where you've got a building owner and a tenant and a customer and a visitor. And all of these sort of entities interacting within the same common environment, all of which being measured, their behaviors, their contacts, their temperatures, their presence, all of which I think really ought to be thought of as, whether the regulation has caught up to it or not, by the way, really ought to be thought of as belonging to all of the individuals, the people who are being sensed at any given time. So, at a fundamental level, what we've built is the ability to recognize that a piece of data belongs to both the owner of the device, right, the person who stood up the IoT network, which is where I think most people's heads are. Well, I own the device, I own the data, but also give that co-ownership to the person who is measured, Tom. So if you're in your office, the building owner may have stuck up a device to measure whether somebody's there, probably a PIR kind of sensor, and obviously they're going to go use that for their reasons. But since you're in that spot, ought you not to also have a say about what's going to be done with the data, about the fact that it's measured your presence? And sort of, dumb motion sensing, room level temperature. Is that really interesting from a privacy perspective? Maybe not. It's
Mm.
debatable. But when you get into video, when you get into audio, when you get into contact tracing, when you get into sensing that's coming off the device that's on your wrist there, this can be quite personal. Um, and what we really want to be able to do is say, look, we don't want to lock things down so much that businesses can no longer use data to operate, because there's a lot of goodness to the business, a lot of goodness to consumers, and I think a lot of goodness to society from a sustainability perspective. More efficient use of space, more efficient use of resources, healthier areas for people to interact. All of that is a societal good. And data will unlock that for us, but we shouldn't be giving up individual liberties at the same time. So that's really the balance that we're after with microshare.
Yeah, yeah. And why is it that this is a fairly crucial moment for the data privacy debate, in your opinion? Because you talk about that at the moment, but specifically right now, what is it that makes it so poignant?
Yeah, I think it's a very crucial moment for IoT data specifically, and I think it's because there's been a lot of publication about the excesses of the online data collection and use. And we're seeing, the social media really be the lightning rod for a lot of that. And you see legislation that's cropping up. Certainly, GDPR is probably the most obvious of those legislations. And though that data was kind of born from this online behaviors, it clearly is written in a way that also embraces IoT. Although I really think that people's awareness of what is being measured about them in the real world is a great lag behind their awareness of what's being measured about their online behaviors. And from my perspective, being well educated in this spot, I think the physical is even some orders of magnitude more dangerous than the online, because I always have the choice of turning off my computer,
Yeah.
putting my cell phone down. But the video cameras and the audio recording and the things that are going on around me that I may not be aware of, they're not part of my personal sphere. I can't really control those things. And that's so the risk, I think, is that the public, the scare that the press particularly is trying to introduce, really catches on, that the regulators, the lawmakers, become too heavy-handed, and they start locking things down so that we can't get data. And if we do that, I think we're going to set the industry back. And what's really worrisome to me, Tom, is that businesses are not going to stop operating based on data, no matter what the regulators say. If we really enforce something draconian, then it'll force these things to go underground. The data will be operated in secret. And I think that's exactly what we don't want as a society. I think we want to open it up. I think we want the light shining directly into these areas so that everyone's aware of what's being collected and why, what the uses are, and make decisions individually and collectively about what are good uses, what are bad uses. But I think it would be foolish of us to think we could stuff the genie back in the bottle and say just because we can regulate it, people won't do these evil things. Evil happens in the darkness. It doesn't happen in the light, in my experience. So that's really, I think, what we need to be doing as a society, is saying, look, these kind of technologies are inevitable. Let's open them up so that we can all appreciate what's going on, and then come up with, thoughtful, um, thoughtful patterns for handling it and balancing that privacy problem. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a fantastic view on things. It's worth noting you mentioned GDPR there, because obviously Microshare is predominantly doing a lot of work in Europe, and of course GDPR being a European regulation. It's not actually North American based, is it? GDPR, it doesn't govern anything in North America, but only companies that may interact. Is that right, or something like that? I think the
That's correct, Tom. So, any multinational has to deal with GDPR just because if your skirt
yeah,
includes anything in Europe, then you're touching on it, which is a lot of our customers are international, or they're at the scale where they
yeah,
have to worry about that. But
yeah,
you also see legislation globally in the U.S., um, no exception. Mostly large states like California data protection is patterned after GDPR that came out
right,
into effect last year. Very similar provisions. You see similar legislation, New York State. So we haven't yet done it as a nation, but you're seeing it in some really significant population areas. So even if you've just got an American focus or a North American focus, you're already going to be needing to deal with some very similar challenges that GDPR has put into the European space. And I think it's just inevitable. You're going to see, unless, well, the more authoritarian regimes aside, I think you're going to see this globally. People following this pattern and rolling it out more, and the press is just making that more likely as these um, excesses become more public.
yeah. Well, I think the awareness factor of this is really important, and you talk about the fact of, you know, you can turn off your camera, you can buy cases on Amazon that enable your camera to be turned off, right, and bits and pieces. But it's the data that's being collected around you. I'm quite interested to learn about the phrase that you've used and that you've kind of gone public to mention, the data marketplace, right? So that's really really interesting, and I like the fact that you're talking about bring it to the forefront. Don't push it underground, because when it goes underground, it's hard to control and evil happens in the darkness, right? Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by a data marketplace, Tim?
Sure. A lot is being talked about, certainly with online stuff, about how companies are collecting it and selling this data and making a fortune based on it. The reality is, I don't think there's that as much money in actually selling data as most people believe. There is a lot of money in keeping data proprietary and learning how to mine it and use it as a strategic weapon. You see that with Google and their ad targeting. You see that with Facebook, similarly. But I think there's a great fear of what's being done with the data that is being collected. Because I have a relationship, perhaps, with Facebook, but the thousands of entities behind them that they may be selling the data onto. I talk about the darkness, right? There's a great unknown there, and so people are quite nervous about that. And what I think is great about a marketplace is that, in my mind, it's the classic European marketplace, open air, stalls that are available. People can walk around and shop, and you may not be buying, but you can see what's on offer. And I think that's kind of the mental image that I have about what we need to do with data, which is not drive these transactions underground, but open them up and allow the individuals to participate in the marketplace as well, to be active, engaged participants. Because if you're contributing data, you ought to know about it. And if you're contributing data, you also should have the opportunity to participate economically in the value that's created from it, whether that's massive amounts of economic value, thousands of pounds and dollars a year, or whether it's cents. It's still an economic value you should be aware of and have the opportunity to participate in. And my most controversial stance about this for the IoT crowd is honestly that the world already has too many devices.
Mm.
We have too many sensors already. What we lack is the ability to take the data from the sensors we've already deployed and get that content to the people who want that information. And the analogy I use is, I have a little dog running around here somewhere. Might have shown up on camera. If everybody who wants to know where he is has to bolt a sensor onto his collar, Eventually it gets ridiculous. You get one on there, it's fine. Two, three, four, five, 10, because my town, my council wants to know if he's licensed and is he in the bounds of my yard. My veterinarian wants to know health. I've got a tracking company that, we can't all be bolting sensors onto things. And even a room, if you go into a conference room in an office building, you look around, there's a lot of protuberances now from the ceilings and the walls. And, how many of these things can we stand up? When actually what we ought to do is have the first person put the sensor on and then be able to share that data to all the people who have an interest in that information. But of course, that has to be done in a way that allows us to share the costs, right? So that's where the marketplace begins to come in. So we can be consuming the data without necessarily depending on putting up a new piece of electronics, another battery, a new network, another widget. Where are we in that continuum? Well, this is not this year, right? This is not a 2021 prediction. No more devices, right? We're going to see a lot of adoption of devices, but then I really do think we're going to start seeing them reduce again. And it's really about creating that more fluid mechanism of exchanging data. But necessarily, it's got to be done in the light. It's got to be done with privacy awareness. It's got to be done with consumer participation, or else we'll never get to that level. But once we do, I think then we can start thinking about more generic sensors, fewer pieces of electronics in our lives, and hopefully actually impact the environment. A good way be less batteries in landfills, less plastic, less electronic manufacturing. That may not be great news for the hardware guys out there, but I think for human life, I think it'll be a net positive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, from a sustainability point of view, I mean, it's widely spoken about the mining for precious materials for batteries is becoming, or is a real issue. The need, and it's a great analogy that you've used there with your pet dog, right? The fact that a sensor for this, a sensor for someone else, that's not sustainable, and you can't grow an ecosystem around more and more hardware, and it also seems illogical, doesn't it? I think the main issue that we're going to face to make this work is that governance around commercial gains.
Absolutely.
and what's within the public interest. We've had some people on the show in the past. In fact, there's for anyone listening and for yourself as well, Tim, a company called EdgeX talking about a PIN working with the Autonomy Institute in North America about how we're going to link places together with certain hardware and a time for that. But I think you're absolutely right. But it's how those hardware manufacturers are then going to monetize that, right?
Yeah.
So, perhaps from a commercial element, the more and more people plugging into that hardware, then they have to pay some sort of as a service-based charge for using that hardware, right? That could be one way. But it's interesting, and I think moving forward, that's something that everyone needs to be really mindful of. When we look back in history, though, global players haven't played that nicely together, have they?
No.
And it's something that we're going to have to address, because this is going to be a real problem, isn't it?
It is. But you can see, if you do look back even in our history, we faced the same problems with mobile telephones, right? Where we had proprietary regional standards, devices that were built specifically for them, and the attempt to lock people in, and that lasted 10 years before, particularly in Europe, there was just the massively strong pressure to integrate, to allow roaming, to rationalize charges, and as the mainstream adopted cellular mobile technologies, the world has had to catch up. It was painful in the middle, right? I remember my first cell phone traveling, $500 charges for a simple phone call because I wasn't aware of which network I was roaming on, and we went through a lot of trouble. Today's world is very different from a mobile perspective, and I think IoT is tracking along as well. We've had proprietary networks, proprietary standards, devices built for specifically. but I think we're accelerating faster with IoT along very similar curves that we did with mobile technology, mobile phone technologies. And I think it'll follow the same kind of general path to the point where we get to, roaming and public networks, and for the people who make hardware, for the people who own the networks, it's going to create a commodity pressure that I think is inevitable. It may not be good news, but I think it is. It is what time it is. But I do think the consumer will win out over in the long run, and then people will have to compete by creating much better devices, more accurate sensors, more robust data, more dependable. And then I think that's where the data marketplace can overlay as the data gets more reliable, as it gets more standardized. That market can open up because now you're trading in things that are consistent. And from data, it's about data formats, right? It's about data quality, data format. Because if you and I are going to swap temperature data, it better look like the same stuff, right? It can't be all proprietary and unique and all that stuff. So that's the kind of point in time problem we're solving at Microshare, is that creating that generic format that creates the fungibility ultimately of data for a given purpose. But I really do think that the market will move in that direction inevitably.
Yeah, I just hope we can get there quicker than we can from the telecom point of view, and that we don't have a situation with SMS messages, for instance. So obviously it's well known that an SMS message originally conceived for engineers, right, to state faults on the line. Then they realised it was popular, started charging, and now it's eventually become free again, and then moved the course onto proprietary platforms. I think if we can get there quicker, that would be great. But it's interesting what you said about the fungibility of data, the usability of that data. And we're talking about GDPR, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but a lot of the clauses and points around GDPR are actually really relevant. So the timely use of this data, is it fit for purpose? Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking too much? How are you storing it? So on and so forth. So it's certainly an interesting time, and I think when it comes to the massive data that can be achieved from sensors, public sensors that people perhaps aren't necessarily aware that they're sharing, it's something that we really need to address. Yeah. Tim, I'm super curious as to your thoughts on the predictions. We always ask people this on the show, and we always ask to say, where are we going? What's happening? I'd really like to learn from specifically from a building point of view, where you think we're heading over the next 5 years, and what people on the street will see when they go into a building, and what a smart building will mean in the future.
Yeah. Sitting here in 2021, most of the building concerns are really about returning people to a healthy, productive work environment. And the tensions are that for at least knowledge workers who have been forced to work from home now have an awareness that it is entirely possible in many cases to continue to do that, and at least in some sort of hybrid capacity. So what we are seeing is that this return to work and the new way of working that just can't be. I think that there was already trends in place. You see companies like WeWork challenging the common paradigm for where you work, how you lease space, how companies engage with the physical. And the quarantines have just driven that into overdrive. So I think for the next 2 years, we're really going to see both the awareness of building owners and employers about the need to ensure the safety so that we don't end up back in lockdowns, whether it's COVID or the next pandemic, that I think all people are now aware can happen at any time, right? There's nothing specifically unique about this point in time. It's happened before. We've just been better at containing it. So I think now that we're aware that healthy spaces need to be a thing, that flexibility in work, where we work, when we work, how we work, need to become just part of the normal wrapper. So what we're seeing very much is, people are doing probably less contact tracing, but people aren't banning it. The people who have early adopted contact tracing are still expanding it. Why are they expanding it? Well, it's not for this current moment anymore. It's so that they don't get caught flat-footed for the next one. And we're seeing this in places where, generally are high-tech manufacturing, pharmaceuticals specifically. Um, these people know that they need to be able to show up for work and deliver the next set of vaccines when the next challenge occurs, and they're building out an infrastructure that will transcend the current, COVID quarantine. So that's a specific part of the market. For places that run, hospitals or office buildings or airports, what they're worried about is, all right, everybody's going to come back to work. There's a need to be more aware of the cleanliness, holistically, of the space. Is the air being circulated properly? Are the surfaces being cleaned? Because it may not be a surface transmission problem, but people are very aware of clutter. They're very aware of
Hmm.
filth. They're very aware of leaky water now. Um, and so, how do I manage the invisible, like air turnover? How do I manage the visible and present that will make people nervous in the current moment, like cleaning? So things like predictive cleaning, things like air quality monitoring, things like density management, right? Are too many people in this space? All of these things are really topical right now for people trying to get their arms around it. But in the long run, what companies are really worried about is, for many large companies, real estate is the single biggest line item expense, right, on their balance sheet or on their earning statements, because it's either a fixed cost because they own it, or it's an ongoing cost because they lease it. And now they're like, well, I've had these buildings empty. So why am I spending so much money? What is the optimal arrangement of that asset to get the most of the productivity with the least amount of risk? All of a sudden, everybody's asking this question: can I do more with less space? And what would that less space look like? Would it be in the city center, or would it be distributed in the countryside? Would it be coffee shops, or is it, private rooms? So people are now looking at, how do I really understand how people are using their spaces optimally, and then how would I rebuild my organization around that physical level of interaction to optimize that for the new world. That's what the next 5 years in the built IoT space is: measuring that, getting smart about it, generating actionable insights, allowing companies to squeeze down their footprints while hopefully improving the quality of life for their employees and their customers. Um, it's a lot of turmoil in one little space, but I think that's exactly what we're going to be faced with in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Tim, fantastic insights. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. You've really got some great views on this, and some things to really think about as well.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And for microshare, obviously, business is doing really well. More funding. Where do we expect to see you guys? What's on the horizon? Obviously, I know you can't say too much, but obviously growing and doing more and more projects.
Yeah, it's been the past year has really been about going global. In 2019, most of our business was in Europe, um, and heavily focused on the UK. Europeans have been much faster in adopting wireless technologies. And so IoT and sensing as a service, no exception to that, just ahead of the curve. But the last year has really seen a global explosion in the awareness. So I think a lot of geographies are playing catch up. So we're now throughout Asia. We're now very deeply penetrated in North America, South America. So for us, it's been a challenge of that physical growth, right? The logistics challenges, the distribution, acquisition, and installation. And so that's really where we've been spending a lot of our time, is making it much easier to get these things all across the globe. So, I think in the coming years, you're going to see us popping up in a lot of different spots. And hopefully beginning to weave all these global experiences together in a way that allows us to learn from each other, because insights you generate in Sao Paulo may be very applicable to insights you might generate in Bristol or need to consume in Bristol. And in the end, I think it's about all of us globally sharing best practices for sustainability, for human well-being, and at the end of the day, fungible, high-quality data is the core of doing that. And I think that's what where you'll see us in these next couple of years.
Yeah, fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been great. We've really enjoyed having you, and we wish you all the best in the future.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.